Hi everyone, thanks for attending this week's webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist, and this is part 2 of our 2-part text editor webinar. And in part 2, we're going to add some more features to the text editor that we started creating last week. So before we get too far, I just want to remind people that all these webinars are recorded, and I'll point out a couple of locations where you can find the recordings. The first place that you can jump over to is if you go to the documentation wiki. Scroll down here to the bottom. There's a link here for webinars, training, and tutorial videos. And that takes you to the videos page, which is pretty much monopolized at this point by the webinars. We've done quite a few in the 6 months or so we've been doing them. And they're here listed in reverse order. You can click on any of them to jump to YouTube to play them. And if the webinar has example projects that you can download, there's a link right alongside. So the example projects from last week's text editor are available here, and then others. Not every webinar has example projects, but the ones that do are linked here. And what I do tend to do is get these example projects cleaned up so that they're also included in whatever the next version of Xojo is that we ship. So some of these older ones here, the example projects are already included in Xojo. And of course, when you're in YouTube, you can actually subscribe to our YouTube channel. I believe it's called Go Xojo. And then you can set it up so you get notifications or whatnot whenever I do upload a video, so that you don't have to keep checking back here. All right, we will jump back here into Xojo. I want to remind everyone when we're going through this, feel free to ask questions. I will scan them periodically, address them as I can. And without further ado, let's get started. So this is the project we had last week. This is our little text editor. Right where we left off, it should be the same one that you can download from that web page, and you can open files with it, resize them, open multiple windows, all that fun stuff. One of the last things we did was add a preferences window that lets you change the font to other things. That's nice and readable. All right, but the font and the size settings are not retained. You can change them in the preferences, but when you quit the app, they're lost when you start back up. So one of the suggestions that people asked about was we cover maybe making this thing be able to actually save and load its preferences. So let's look at doing that first. So right now the preferences are tracked here on the app. And we simply have two properties. One for the font name that's just a string, and one for the size that's just an integer. And these are changed and used by the preferences window. So all we really need to do to save these preferences is save them somewhere on the disk. So when the app closes, essentially, so that when the app starts, it can load them up and then set these values accordingly, and then call the update. Actually, won't even need to call update unless there's some windows open, but on minor implementation details. So let me just switch over to my master one so I can move any source code I want to move. So if you want to save preferences, you're going to want to put them in a file of some kind. Now, there's all kinds of files that you can use. You could even stick it in a database if you wanted, if you had a wide variety of preferences and you wanted to track them in that way. XML is commonly used. If you wanted to use Windows-specific settings, you could set up registry keys and save things in the registry. On OS X, plist files are often used if you go through the standard OS X mechanism. But if you want not a standard, but kind of a cross-platform simple way to do it, you can just write the preferences you want out in a simple file format. Probably the simplest thing that you can use with Xojo is a JSON text file. So let's create a new method here. And I'll just call it save preferences. Now if you've never used the JSON class before, that's it. JSON item is the class. And it works very, very similarly to a dictionary. But the data is stored in the JSON format, which is, I think, JavaScript object notation or something like that. Who knows what these acronyms are? They change them all the time anyway. But that means this is really easy to work with since it's very similar to a dictionary. And since we only have a couple values, we can actually type the variable name right. We can assign our preferences to it. So this is just adding our two properties into the JSON item using the dictionary syntax that it has available. And then here I'm just going to cut and paste a little bit of code because this is more typing than I want to do now. And then the next step is to find a place to save this file, this JSON file that we're going to create. And right now I have it set up here so that it's going to, if we're running in debug mode, it's just going to save the preferences into a folder right on the desktop. But if you were actually creating a standalone build, and more typically where you'd want to put it, I only put it on the desktop here so I can find it easily. Normally you'd want to put something here. Special folder, and application data is one of the special folders. And this is user-specific application data that you can pretty much put wherever you want. The location of this folder varies depending on the operating system platform, of course. But you do have full read-write access to it, so you can write what you want in there. And on OS 10, it's great because you do get read-write access to this area, and sandboxing doesn't come and bite you if you're using this area to write out your preferences or whatever other support files your app needs. So this is just creating a folder to put that in, and then it's making sure that the folder item was, not nil, and then it creates it as a folder. And then within that folder, it creates another file that we're going to stick the preferences in, just called XojoText.json. And a lot of boring code here, but then we're just going to write out the text from our JSON item to that file. And if you look right here, the JSON class, the JSON item class, has a toString method, which will just convert the contents of the JSON item into a string that we can output into the text file. And that's it. So this saves our measly 2 preferences. Of course, if we had more, you could follow this pattern of adding more properties to the app class and then saving them in JSON item in this way, and they would still get saved. But this is what saves it. So what we can do here is we can call this method, and I can probably change it to private since it's really only going to be called by the app. And I can add a close event handler. So when the application is closed, I can tell it to save its preferences. So if I go here, this will remain at Courier. So we'll change it to Comic Sans and tweak the font size. All right, so that worked. Font looks kind of gross. So we'll quit. We didn't get an error when we quit, which theoretically should have saved everything. So I'm over here looking up. So here I've got desktop. This is the folder that got created, and this is the preferences file that just was created. And I could probably open this with something. Actually, I probably could have opened it with Xojo Edit itself, but it wasn't running. So here you can see what JSON text looks like. And it's a pretty simple file format. It's very popular with transmission of the internet type data because it is nice and compact, but it does work great for this purpose as well. And of course, you don't have to use this technique. You could use XML. Like I said, you could use a database. You could create your own proprietary file format. You could use a registry on Windows. Whatever works. There's lots of ways to save preferences, but the general technique here works fine. So now let's load the preferences. So we'll add a new method. And I will just paste in a bunch of code here. It's mostly the same. Just kind of doing the reverse. you're getting a path to where we save the preference file. And then reading it in as text. And then we create a new JSON item, and we load that text into it. And this is part of the constructor where it can read in a piece of text that's in the format of a JSON item. And then it sets up the structure and everything so that we can access its values using the nice dictionary syntax here, which is really convenient because then now that we've found the file loaded into the JSON item, we can just extract out the values we want and save them to our properties on the app class so that they now work with the app just as they did before. And we would add another event handler here to actually load these preferences when the app starts. So now, when the app starts, it will load the preferences, and when it closes, it will save them. So now when we run the XojoText here, you can see it already has the ugly font in place. And because of the way we built our preferences window last week, it's already checking whatever is set on the app properties and auto highlighting them here in the fields and the pop-up menu on the preferences window. So that's how you can add preferences to your application. Pretty straightforward. Like I said, if you had a lot, you may want to have a different technique rather than throwing all your properties on the app class. You may want to have a class that's in your project that's specifically responsible for dealing with preferences, maybe even responsible for saving and loading them. And that's just part of general design. When apps get more complicated, you want to encapsulate things so that they're easier to maintain. But the overall techniques remain the same. All right, so we've covered save preferences here. Let me just see if we have any questions related to that before I move on to the next one. And Charles here is asking a question regarding special folder, because there is a special folder item in there called special folder.preferences. And he's noting I didn't use that. And if we go back here, you see I didn't use special folder.preferences, which is a valid selection. And the reason I didn't use that is primarily because of OS 10. And the answer is you should not use that on OS 10 any longer. Starting with, I think it was Lion, Apple and OS 10 stuff does not want you directly writing files in there. The files that get written there are written directly by the OS 10 Preferences API, which you cannot directly access from Xojo, but is available if you use a third-party library like the macOS lib open source project. And that would write stuff directly there. So if you were writing your preferences file directly using special folder.preferences, at least on OS 10, that would prevent you from being able to sandbox your application, as that would be a violation. But if you write here in special folder application data, you're perfectly safe. On Windows, you could certainly still use special folder.preferences. It doesn't have the same restriction. All right, checking what's next on my list here. All right, one thing that we can do here is add a word count to our little editor app so that when we open a file, as we were typing or after a file's open, we could show a word count probably right up here in the title bar would be easiest. So let's see how we would go about adding a feature like that. Well, that's part of the window that's displaying the document. So it seems like the word count's going to want to go on the main window itself. And we'll start with by adding a method here. Which I will call word count. And we'll have it return an integer that is the number of words. By default, I'll have it return 0 because it's not counting anything. Now, when do we want it to count the words? Well, to start with, probably when you're typing. So let's open up some controls here. So if we look at the edit area, take a look at its event handlers. The text change event handler is called anytime any of the text that's being edited is changed in some manner. So here we can use this method to say, well, if the text changed, odds are number of words may have changed. So here we can display our word count. So let me just make sure I use my consistent code. So here we could do something like now this isn't going to be final code, it's kind of just testing. This is going to obliterate our title that we have now. But you can see this will just display the word count right in the title bar. So if I start typing here, I get a number that displays it's always going to be 0 because we're not actually counting the words. That's kind of a little unit testing thing where we're making sure that our method actually returns the expected result. In this case, we always expect it to return 0. So let's put in a little rinky-dink algorithm here that's going to count some words. So this little bit of code is going to take the code that's in the the text that's in the text area, split it using the empty string. This is a neat little trick because this essentially will split on every character. So you'll end up with a big array with one entry for each character in the text. And this allows us to loop through the text character by character very, very quickly. If you try doing this using the mid or the left lookup functions, those can get pretty slow as the text starts to get large. So this is a lot faster. And then here, I've just created a simple string that contains what I consider to be characters that are part of words. And then we just loop through this giant array. And if we're in a word, then we set the word isWord to true. And then if we stop looking at a word, we increase the word count. So essentially, you can picture it as if looking through this text. We'd start here at dim. That is one of the valid characters. So we'd be in a word. We'd get to this space. We'd no longer be in a word. So we'd increase the word count by 1. We'd hit this WC. We'd be in a word. And we hit the space. We're no longer in a word. So now we're up to 2 words. Very simple word counting, but accurate enough for our purposes. So now if we rerun this, and you can see the word count increases pretty much as I hit spaces or returns or whatnot. But that's obviously not quite good enough. So let's see about tweaking this a little bit more. Now the way that I looked at doing this is because we want to put this in the title bar, and we already are when we're loading files and saving files, we're updating the title bar. It probably makes sense to pull that out into its own method so that we're pretty consistent about how we go about that. Otherwise, we'll have to update code in a bunch of places to make sure that it's doing the word count there, and we could forget something and have some bugs. So I'll add a new method here. We'll call this setTitle. And I just have some simple code here that is just checking if we have a current file that's loaded. Then we'll display its name in the title bar, and then in parentheses we'll display the word count. And if we don't have a current file loaded, so it's just a new window that hasn't been saved yet, we'll display XojoText in the title bar with the word count. So now we can use this setTitle method anywhere that we are actually monkeying around with the title. So like right here, we don't need to do that here, but we don't want to put it before where it was. We want to put it after. And why is that? Well, the reason is our little setTitle method is using a window property, mCurrentFile, as you can see is a window property right here, to check if it shows the file name in the title bar. Well, we want to make sure we call it after we've actually given mCurrentFile a value, otherwise it won't do what we expect. And I think save also has the same situation. And then we can go back to here. And if I wanted to be sure, I could do a quick search here. to see if there's any other cases where I'm monkeying around with the title, and there are not. The only two cases where I'm using .title are in our setTitle method, which is what I would want. So that looks like that covered everything. So you can see it loaded the text file, displayed the word count here, and this is approximately correct. When I opened this up in a text wrangler, I think there was a difference of, I don't know, maybe 10 or so words. And our algorithm is pretty simple. It doesn't count things like quoted text, which can throw off word counts. But that's pretty good for a few lines of code. So that's how you can add a word count to our little text editor. All right, let me just check what's next here. All right, the next thing we're going to want is play around with the modified flag. Let me just check if there's any questions related to this. This is a question, could I test it with a non-English letter? Yeah, we can try that. I'm going to have to cut and paste. I'm not even sure how I type these non-English letters. Let's see here. So I could add a non-English letter here. This was in the question. Of course, the next question is, how do I type that non-English letter? I guess I can just cut and paste that as well. So because we're doing the string, that I did expect that to work, and luckily it did. Because we're doing a string and it knows the encodings and everything like that, it appears it's able to do all the matching and the counting just as you would expect. So yeah, if you have different languages or characters or other things you want to count as words, by all means, you can just add them to this thing. I don't know that I would necessarily use this as a basis for a reliable word count function. I'm sure there's other ones available that might be a lot smarter than this, but there you go. All right, when you're playing around with this, at least on OS 10, often apps you see when you start typing and whatever you're doing becomes changed or dirty. On OS 10, you see a little dot in the little close button here. So that would be kind of nice to do. So we can do that here. There is built-in support for that. And there's a property here of the window called contents changed. It is a Boolean that you can just set true or false to show the dot. So here I'm setting it to true whenever any of the text changes that's in the text area. And that simple little one line of code will now cause the dot to appear as I'm typing. And that's great. But it also is going to appear right after I open up a file. And it really shouldn't, so we should clear that after opening a file because the file's not yet dirty. And we should probably clear it after saving a file, because that means it's no longer dirty. You've saved it to disk, and the disk now has the most recent copy. So here we have some text. When we save it, it goes away. If we open some text, it is not marked as dirty until we type in it. So that was a pretty easy one to add, the modified flag, but makes the app look a little nicer. One thing you may see on other platforms that don't have that indicator is some apps might throw something in the title bar to indicate that it's dirty, maybe an asterisk of some kind, or even a text note that says edited or modified or something like that. And you can certainly do that as well. And you would probably start to do, not that we'd necessarily see it here, but you would probably start to make note of conditional compilation. So you could do All right, so if we're running on a Mac, which has this feature, then we can use that technique. Otherwise, then we have to figure out how we want to deal with that, because set title will override any changes we made with that. So now maybe we want to change the title first. And then if we're not on OS 10, we can then modify the title. Now that's not going to work. If we can't just modify the title and add a asterisk to it, because then we'll keep getting asterisks added to the end. But probably what would make the most sense is to, maybe not even do it like this. Thinking on the fly here. We continue to use this property, which is still available on the other platforms. It just doesn't automatically update any button in the corner like you see here. But we could, in set title, we could do it right here so that we just add a additional check mark. So we could do something like if not all right, so here we'll create a little string, and then if we're not running on OS 10 and if our contents has changed, we'll set this little dirty mark character, put a space in the front, and then we can just append it to the end like that. And actually, I'm going to take this out so we can actually see it here, since I am running on OS 10. So you can see it now added a little star here to the side that you could display on Windows or Linux, or you can display it in the front, or however makes sense for your app. So that is yet another benefit of having our stuff already pre-encapsulated into this method. We're able to make use of that. But I'm not keeping that right now. All right, that was all right. The next thing I want to take a look at is our open handling. Right now, in order to open a file, you actually have to have a window open. So if I close the window, I can't just pick open. I have to pick new first. And if I've started typing and I pick open, it's going to immediately just replace what was typed with the new file. Might make more sense if there's anything in here and I pick open, that it opens it in a new window rather than replacing the current one. And it might make sense that this open actually does something and opens a new window with the file. We can make those changes pretty easily. Right now, the main window, if we look at the menu handler, is what has the file open menu handler. And there is not one on the app for a menu handler, which is why it is grayed out when there is no window open. So to start with, we can add a menu handler here to the app for file open. And this will now allow the file open menu to be enabled when there are no windows open. And that's great. So what do we want to do there? Let me just switch back to my code so I make sure I show you the right thing. So essentially, we're going to want to do pretty much the same thing we're doing on the window, which is prompt for a file, create a new window, and then load it using the new window that was open. Now, if I tried to run, let me just save, but if I tried to run this, it should get an error here. Right on this line. And this is telling us that we can't call a load file because it's protected. And if we go back here, we'll see that indeed it is. It's actually protected and marked as private. Not technically protected, but protected as in you can't access it. So it's private. So we need to make that public. So now, because it's public, this will be able to call it. So the error will go away. So now if I close the window here, open is now enabled, as it should be, because we put the menu handler in place. And when I click it, it calls the menu handler code and now creates a new instance of a window with the text in it. The next thing to think about is what we have right here for the file open code. We don't really need that to be doing what it's doing there in every case. Really what we want is if there's no text in the edit area, then we can prompt for a file and load it right into the text area, which is what load file will do because we're right on this. So it'll load it into the currently open window. But if the text area is not empty, then we want to actually prompt for a file, but we want to open it in a new window. Well, we already implemented the code to do that right here in the file open. And the way menu handlers work is they cascade backwards, depending on what you return from a menu handler. So in particular, you can see this return true right here. If you return true from a menu handler, it means stop processing any menu handlers that may be farther back. And in this case, that's on the app event the app object. So when I return true here, it says, all right, don't run the file open event, the file open menu handler on the app class. We're done. But instead, I can return false here, which will tell it to let the file the file open menu handler on the app run. So hopefully that makes sense. This one, we don't want what's on file open to run because we're prompting for our own file and we're loading it into the current window. But this one, we do want file open to run so that a new window gets created with the file loaded. So now I have some text here. So when I pick this, it should open it up in a new window rather than replacing what was here, and it did. So that's good. All right, that's the open thing. All right, the next thing we want to do here, let me just check how we're doing on time. We're doing great. Are any questions on any of these other things before we move on to the bigger change, which is going to be to add essentially a list box to the left-hand side of our main window, which will contain a list of all the open documents. And we can just click on to see them in the editing area. So in order to do that, I want to prep up my other project. All right, so if you look at Text Wrangler here, I think, it has some way to do this. Yeah, here it is. So you can see here on the left-hand side, it would have documents that you're open and editing here on the left, and as you click on them, it would let you go between them, which is kind of neat when you're working with a lot of stuff, so you don't end up with a bazillion of these windows floating all over your screen. So I want to implement something similar to that. So first thing is we need to tweak our UI a little bit here. We don't want the edit area to take up the whole window work area. And I'm going to add a list box over to the left-hand side. All right, so I got a list box there, and we run. Not going to see a whole lot that's different. We now have our list box on the side with nothing in it and no way to add anything in it at the moment. And then we still have our editing area here. So we'll go back to the main window. Start with load file. And you can see here when it's loading, it fetches the file from disk using a text input stream, assigns it to the editing area, and then does a few other things here regarding setting what the current file is or whatnot. Well, we want to change this behavior a little bit so that we're actually kind of putting this stuff into the list box so that we can refer to it more easily. So I'm just looking at, make sure I tweak this in the right order. There's a fair amount of changes here, and I'm bound to make mistakes, even though I'm looking at my working project. So here we're going to add a row to the list box that has just the name of the file that we're opening. And then we're going to save in the row tag the text. And we also want to save something else, and we'll stick that in the cell tag. And you get one of those for each cell, but we only have one column, so we really only got row tag and a single cell tag to work with. And we'll set that to the actual file. Now we're not going to need much of the rest of this stuff here. We're not going to want to set the edit area right now. We can still close this. And we're not really going to want to set the current file just yet. And probably not going to be want to doing anything with the title just yet. And I guess that probably is relatively safe to work with for now. So now the other thing is, well, how do we display this information? Well, we'll do that when the appropriate item is selected in the list. So let's select the item in the list that we just added. And then let's go to our list and add an event handler. We're going to add the change event handler. And this is called whenever a different row is selected. And I'm going to cut and paste this code. All right, so the first thing is we're making sure a row is selected. If there isn't one selected, we're just going to get out and not do anything. And then you'll notice there's use of a property here, and I'm going to comment out for the moment because we haven't added it. And you'll see why this is necessary after we run through the first example. But now we just get the text that we saved in the row tag, and now we assign it to the edit area because a new row has been selected. And then we assign the current file, the file that we saved in the cell tag. And now that we have these two things set up appropriately, we can call set title to adjust the title that's in the window itself. So theoretically, this might do something or not. Oh, another property we're not doing anything with yet. So we'll comment that out. So I open up something here, and you can see it now added it here and displayed its text here. And if I open another one, which one was that? It opened it. Oh, we didn't change the code in the open event to not open new windows each time, so we have to go back and do that. So we can't quite test our change just yet. All right, I'm just looking at my old my working one to see what I need to tweak to get that. Right now, looking at file open, it was checking if the edit area was blank, and it was not. So it is loading the file into the area, but if it is blank, it is calling the file open handler. And that's not quite the behavior we're going to want in this new multi-tab world, if you will, because we don't want we don't want a new window. We just want essentially a new entry in the list box, if you will. So I'm going to comment out this code that we just added so that well, actually, I got to comment out more than that, don't I? I want to comment that and that. So we'll put it back the way it was so that it will always call load file whenever we want to load a file. And if we look back at load file, you can see that every time load file loads a file, it actually creates using add row a new entry in the list box. So it's kind of going to do the behavior we want. So let me try this. All right, so now each time we open a file, we're getting a new entry here. Now you might expect that when I click back on test one, that it's going to show the text that was there, which wasn't much. It was just like test or something like that. And it shows that, and it shows that. That's pretty cool. Starting to work properly. We can add more, open more files here. And you can see the header changes with the word counts. Got to press return for it to count because of our little algorithm. But you'll notice it didn't save any changes. So that's the next thing to start to think about, is we want to still save the changes as they're being, as they're made, so that as you click around, you actually get the files that you've been playing with. All right, so if we go back to this event handler here, the text change event handler is, like we talked about before, what is called whenever the text is modified in any way. Now here, we could do something along the lines of, well, the text is modified. We can update the row tag in the list box with the modified text. The row tag takes a parameter, as you can see here, looking at the syntax help. That's the row that you want to update. But we don't actually, well, we kind of know the row, I guess, but we didn't actually save it. So I could probably do something like row tag dot, not row tag, file list dot list index. And list index, of course, the property that returns whatever the current selected row is in the list box. And we can assign this to be the text of the text area. And this will kind of do something interesting, but it won't be the behavior you expect. And let's see what this looks like. So that just has the word text in it, or test in it, sorry. And this one has some larger thing. Now, if I click back on test one, it still says test. We haven't done any monkeying around, but I suspect if I start typing in here, oh, now it's saving everything just fine. I didn't expect it to work. I actually expected it not to work. Go figure. The opposite of the problem I usually have. Well, that's good. It's always nice when something works, but it's not always good when things work and you don't know why. And what I expected to happen was that this text change event was going to override the text, because text change is called lots of times, and it's called not just when I'm typing in the window and changing the text, but when a file gets loaded. And well, not directly here, but calling, if I go back here, where is it? Right here. Yeah, this line here would change, would call the text change event handler. And I think the reason that it actually is working, because of an improvement I did in this version, is I made use of this value here. Whereas, as you can tell looking at my older code, I actually had a separate property I was using to track what was entered. And because the property was changed later in the method, I suspect that it wasn't updated when the text change event was called. So in my older version, I was getting the wrong row updated. So the text was getting, the incorrect rows were getting updated with text. So it was an unfortunate bug. This works around the bug. So cool, less code, less bugs, always a plus. The other thing to tweak with that is when we create new files, we can have them create new entries in the list box. So if I go back, what do I want to do? I want to add new method, I guess. So here, this new file method will just add a new row. We'll call it untitled. We'll set the focus to it. And let's turn that off. We may not need it. We'll add file new as a menu handler, and this will simply call our new file method. So now not only when we open documents here, but if I press Command N, I'll get new documents. So that's cool. Easy enough to add, and is working as we expect. So that's down the road of tab editing. Certainly, there's other things that I would want to add as I was beefing this up, and maybe I will add some of these other things as I get this more cleaned up to include with Xojo itself. But you might recall the Text Wrangler had a little close button, or at least a way to close these things. Right now we don't, and we can add a whole bunch of them, but we don't have any way to close them. I don't have a menu item here that says close. There's no indicator on the list or for a button I can press. There's nothing down here. And certainly adding more elements to the window, maybe a plus button down here to quickly add items and a minus button to remove them. Little things like that start to be ways you can make this a little easier to use and look a little nicer. And let me just check the time and any questions here before we move on to the last thing. We got a few minutes to cover the last thing, so let's see if we can do that. The last thing that would be probably pretty cool is to be able to have a splitter here that you can drag to increase or decrease the size of the left-hand or the right-hand side. Now, unfortunately, Xojo does not include a splitter control, but you can make one. So how would we make a splitter control? Well, it actually has to be something on the window. And in this case, canvas will work reasonably well. I'm just going to make a canvas here and resize it so it's kind of in the middle. And then I'm going to lock it to the bottom. So there, now we have a little canvas here. It's not going to be visible when you run your app or anything just yet, but we can start to make it visible. So let's add a few event handlers to our canvas. Start with paint, and we'll just throw a color on here so that it makes it stand out. It won't certainly match any nice UI you've ever seen, but that's fine. And we're going to add a couple other event handlers here related to dragging so that we can start to handle the dragging it around to resize things. So for the paint event handler, I'm just going to draw it in kind of a darker gray color. And if we run the project, you'll now see the little splitter is showing up as a different color, so you kind of know where it is. Let's see, now there'll be a lot of copying and pasting of code here because it's a little longer and we're running low on time. So the first thing is in the mouse enter, I'm going to change the mouse cursor to kind of give an indication that this is can be dragged. So you can see here it's changing to these double arrows, which normally indicate you can then click and drag it to the left or the right. And that's just, all that does is change the arrows. And then in the mouse down event handler, I'm going to assign a property that I'm going to add to the window momentarily of the start position of wherever the mouse was initially clicked on the our resizing canvas. And that's just an integer, so we'll just add that as a property here. And we want to return true, which allows the drag event to be called. And this is where most of our code is going to go. So here we're going to calculate the offset for how far has the drag actually occurred. And that's always going to be whatever the current x coordinate is minus whatever the starting x coordinate is or was. And we can use that offset to adjust our two main controls that are on the window. So we can increase the width of the file list by the offset, and that'll make the left-hand side grow or shrink, or at least, yeah, grow and shrink based on this, because the offset will become negative if we go to the left. And then on the edit area, we can adjust its left coordinate to increase so that it moves. And we can also shrink its width by the offset amount so that it essentially gets scrunched down. And after that's the main controls that are adjusted, we can then make sure the splitter itself gets moved so that it continues to follow the mouse cursor. So we'll open up some text here. So now I can drag and resize, and you can see how it works. As I scrunch this, I get the automatic ellipses that list boxes will do, and as I go this way, I get the word wrapping that kicks into effect. Now, obviously, this is just the beginnings of the implementation. Having minimum and maximum sizes are usually good on these sort of splitters, because if I completely go off the screen and I let go of the mouse, my splitter's gone. Well, it looks like maybe I can, no, that's the whole resize one. So now the splitter's gone. I don't have any way to get it back. So that sort of thing. But that's all easily trackable, by using, tracking what you want for maximum offsets or maximum size of widths and whatnot. But that's how you can put a splitter on something like this. And of course, you would definitely want to change your paint event to not make it just be a giant gray bar. You'd probably want to make it have something a little fancier. You often see these little vertical grabber things, sometimes displayed in the middle of a splitter, or dots. It can vary. I can't say there's any particular standard, but certainly a gray bar is not that standard. All right, I actually got through everything I wanted to cover today without having to rush too much, I hope. I'm just going to check over here if we got any other outstanding questions. I don't see any. So I will again remind everyone that this video and the accompanying example project will show up here. What day is today? Today is the 19th. So yeah, it'll be up here before the end of the week, I would expect. So certainly check here, subscribe to the YouTube channel so you'll see that. As I will be doing at every one of these webinars, I will be reminding you that you want to be at XTC in 2014. Not only is it in Las Vegas, which should be quite fun and bright and shiny, but you're going to have 38 sessions from lots of people, not just me. Certainly some of you are probably getting tired of hearing my voice over and over week after week. So come to XTC. You'll get to hear a bunch of other people talk about things that are cool. Hearing Joe talk about the Xojo compiler, some people really, really love that stuff. Jared's a great presenter, and he's doing a couple design pattern topics. We get all kinds of people here that are presenting, all Xojo users for many, many years, great people. Definitely want to be there, check that out. It's the place to be. And then lastly, I remind everyone of the forum. Come here, learn, help others, ask questions, answer questions, whatever works. I scan this all the time, trying to help people out. I often refer people to these webinars that I do every week that you guys are here for live, because some people either didn't know about them or missed them or whatever, and they can go to the recordings and check them out. So by all means, take advantage of the forum. Gavin is asking if there is a survey. Not this week. I need to come up with some better surveys than what I've done in the past, so no surveys or polls this week. But I thank everyone for reminding me about that, as you all know how I forget things. And I guess that is it. There is no webinar next week. It is Thanksgiving week is the end of next week, and I actually have children who are out of school for a good portion of next week, and it is a bad combination to try and do webinars with kids running around the house. So there'll be no webinar next week, but they'll start back up in December. And then should sometime in December post the schedule for the webinars that will be starting up again in 2014. Can't believe that's already coming around the corner. So if you have topics, by all means, do let me know. Thanks everyone for attending. Stay tuned for more, and have a great rest of your day.